Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m., Thursday, the 7th of November, and you are watching episode 150 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Terra Australis, prison or capitalist venture, is my guest, Dr. Christopher Reynolds, educator, political advisor, and author. Chris is an accomplished academic, completing his PhD and master's degree at the prestigious Claremont Graduate University in California. He has held appointments with both the United States Senate and House of Representatives. As a senior professional staff member with the US Senate Committee on the Judiciary, Juvenile Sub-Justice Committee, he worked under Senators Edward Kennedy and Mitch McConnell. Chris worked on several projects with White House staff, receiving accommodation from President Ronald Reagan. In Australia, Chris held the position of Executive Officer with New South Minister of Public Works, Ports, Roads and Darling Harbour, and was the Executive Director of the World Trade Centre, Sydney. He was also a member of the Brunei Economic Development Council Subcommittee on Oil and Gas Diversification and the chair of the Ep150 Study Centre Consortium meeting. With his beginnings as a teacher, Chris has maintained an interest in developing education services and created a program to increase children's learning and intellectual capacity. This unique program gained recognition in the Oxford-Cambridge Guide of Global Education and Skills in 2010 and 2011, and was among the top 200 programs in the world for innovative education. Chris is now a full-time author. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you on. It was interesting. I caught up with you at the APEC conference back in October, and we had a little chat, and you introduced everyone to your book that's sitting there in the background. But before we get on to the book and a bit of history about the origins of settlement in Australia and development, maybe you could give us a bit of an insight of your youth and maybe some of the canings you got as well.
I missed that. There's some of my what?
Your misspent youth and some of the canings you got as well.
No, I didn't hear you. That was a block out, I think, certainly. My misspent youth. I don't think it was misspent. I mean, just because I went to school with Malcolm and Angus Young, who became ACDC, I don't think that was a misspent. And then I went on to become friends with Dr. Bernard Neeson, who became Doc Neeson, the lead singer of the Angels. So, yeah, I did mess around with a few fellas that became famous with their music. But I had a great time as my youth. But anyway, I suppose also getting into public speaking when I was young, I suppose, and winning a lot of competition prepared me to go on and work in Hollywood radio. And then I did regular interviews with NBN out of Newcastle for a number of years. So that ended up being good training, I suppose. And, I moved myself into university, paid my way through university, and ended up with 5 degrees. So, I don't know if my youth was that misspent. Thank you very much.
Well, what drove you onto this, the academic side of things? I mean, obviously, from your background, you're a fairly good sportsman and that. What's the triggers that make you take a certain path? I mean, you've got your family background and things like that, and you go to school with different types of people. You have different educators that may be an influence on you. But what are the things that triggered you to go onto the academic side and the course you did in regards to going over to the United States and finishing your PhD and masters over there?
Well, actually,
you've hit on any one point?
Well, actually, you've hit on something that's actually quite important. When I was about 13 or 14, they suddenly people appeared in class and said, today we're doing a little test. So they handed out these tests, and I looked at them over and I considered them and I took my time and answered the questions. Well, it turned out to be an IQ test and I failed. So, yeah, I know, it wouldn't work that well that day. So they actually called me down to a career guidance counsellor office. And they said, basically they said, you're so dumb, you need to leave school immediately. And I just didn't know what to do. I was just broken. I mean, how on earth could I go home at age 14 and say they're kicking me out of school because I'm so stupid? And I said, couldn't I please stay and do my HSC? And the fella said, you would so struggle to do your HSC exams. I'd be surprised if you'd get through it. And I said, well, what's the chance I could finish high school? He said, exceptionally slim. I don't know how you would. And I said, well, do you think I could go to university? And this man laughed at me. And I was so broken. And I didn't know what to do or how to tell my parents what I'd been told. And so I just put my head down and I began to work. Well, that next year I got promoted to the, 3A and then into 4A. And then I got 5 A's and a C for my HSC. And then in my school certificate and then my HSC, I managed to get a couple of university scholarships and graduated to 3 universities. So at that stage, I had a young romance and I followed the young lady to South Australia. And I eventually, finished the degrees there. And then I did a degree in theology through Melbourne University, which was extremely difficult, and went off to America. So, I sort of bumped along as life sort of opened its opportunities. But in America, I accidentally picked a university, Claremont. I turned down acceptance into Harvard, and he was the career guidance counselor laughing at me. And I turned down Harvard and I went to Claremont. Well, it wasn't until I got there that I then realized it was the Cambridge Oxford of America. And it was one professor to 4 students. And I had an incredible education. And I did rather well. And the university did something that it hadn't done before. And that is it gave a full fellowship to a foreign student for 2 years. They paid all of my fees at $150,000 a year and all of my accommodation. I then set a university record with a 7-year degree in 3 years, and that launched me into working in Washington, D.C. So, yes, it was an interesting pathway that I hadn't planned it. It basically was just me sort of bumping against the walls with opportunities that came my way.
Well, it's a good thing you didn't take any notice of the guidance counsellor.
Yeah,
that's for sure. So you haven't had a school reunion and met him again or anything like that?
No, I know. But what's interesting is that the fellows I went to school with, we had such fun at school, and they've continued to meet. I've spent a lot of my time overseas, and I'm still in contact with a number of the people 50 years later that I went to school with, and we're still friends, people I've known since I was 6 years old.
Well, I think that's a strange thing too. I mean, I still have contacts with some of my original primary school friends and things like that, and so do my children. But a lot of kids, sort of don't, these days don't seem to have that connection. They may have a little click, but they don't seem to enjoy school like we did. I thought I hated missing school. I thought, it was the worst thing in the world if you didn't get down for your daily dose of learning and also participation on the playing field, mucking around with your friends. Whether it was get down to, like, I don't know about you, but we used to get down to school before 8 o'clock in the morning, and usually in those days there was a groundskeeper. And they usually opened up the facilities and that, and you could grab a football depending on the season, cricket ball, cricket equipment, and go and have a hit or a kick or whatever. But there was a good number of kids arriving early to school to muck around and have that camaraderie. Even if the groundsman wasn't there early enough to do things, well, it was just bulldog or something like that, or someone had a ball to play brandy or something.
Yeah.
And some of the girls were the same. They were all course and that, but it doesn't seem to be a thing these days.
Yeah, I suppose coming from Sydney too. I mean, that strong currency lad and lasses thing that had come through the culture was still very much alive in Sydney. You know, people look for the lark and the fun, and you know, and larrikins. We were still. I grew up sort of being a larrikin, looking for things that gave you fun and enjoyed life. But there's something else you just touched on was this business of me struggling through school. And you know, and really being tenacious, I was going to make a success against the odds that were against me. In my home that I grew up with, there were only two books, two poetry books. There were no other books in my home. So I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, born into Catholic, Irish Catholic, voting for the Labor Party family. And I mean, you know, people didn't even think about university. I remember when I told my mother I was going off to do my PhD, she said, "Well, that's lovely, son. What's a PhD?" And that was the level of education, meaning there wasn't one where I grew up. But something you touched on was this sort of, I suppose, being aware of what it is to struggle in school. I suppose looking back is probably the motivation for why I helped people, young youth. When I was at university, I was qualified to be a teacher, and then I gave it away to run a place called the House of the Rock to help people that were unemployable and that the society had basically rejected. So I ran this place called the House of the Rock, and I had an 85, 90% success rate in helping these people turn their lives around and get work. So I think I fostered 5 kids through school, and 1,000 people had stayed in my 5 houses before I was 30. But later on, after I had this career in politics and business, I gave it all away, and I set up a school in the Middle East to help kids that, again, the system had rejected because their IQs were so low they couldn't get into school. And I developed a program to actually increase what you'd call their IQ levels. So children that had IQs of in their 60s and 80s, within 1 or 2 years, I'd increased their neurological capacity, their efficiency, and was able to put them back into school. Cambridge and Oxford University came out and had a look at what I was doing in the Middle East, and they listed me in the top 200 programs in the world. Not one Australian school has ever been considered. So again, I suppose I've always had this sort of inclination to help children get a decent education and to fight all those systems and categories that would hold them back.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things. Far too many people pigeonhole children fairly early. But it's like any person, a child has, you know, talents, but sometimes it takes something to find what their talent is. And sometimes it doesn't have to be academic. It could be they could just be a good player of a musical instrument that gives them the confidence to sort of put themselves there. But I also found that one of the biggest thing, and to my detriment, I never sort of took it on because I was a bit of an introvert as a kid. But I noticed with my children, when they did go to school and things like debating was offered, they flourished. Like person who enters into something like debating and that sort of goes ahead leaps and bounds in regards to being articulate and also having control of the language. And I don't think there's any greater skill for anyone to master our language and be articulate. And that's probably a big failing of our education system at the moment. I mean, most kids can't get through a sentence without a whole set of expletives, mainly because they just aren't taught or don't, you know, there's no intention to get them to master our language. And I think that's very sad.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's about of finding where the strengths and the weaknesses are in a child's capacity. And then with the work I was doing was working on those weaknesses to actually strengthen them. But as you just said, you know, people have various, I don't know what it is, it's sort of inclinations or drives. But, you know, as you said, some people go to music, others go to literature, others are good with their hands. So it's sort of, it depends on an interest as well and being able to encourage the person to get in and become good at what they want to do.
Well, we better move on from that subject to what we're what we're really talking about. But maybe you can give us a bit of this insight of your time in America, because, but we don't. We might come back for another talk later on and talk about this current election. But it's just interesting that you after you graduated from Claremont, you went into the political side, and you were in Washington, obviously involved with the Senate and things like that. But it's interesting. One of the people you work with is Edward Kennedy, a Democrat, and then the other person is Mitch McConnell that you mentioned. Now, that's a Republican. Now, was that at the same time in the same field, and what's the difference? Well, it's going back a few years, and politics has changed. But at that time, what was the difference between a Republican and a Democrat back in that era?
Well, you've got two questions there. How on earth did I manage to do it? I'm the only Australian, again, with the tenacity that I walked the halls of the Congress for a year. I literally wore holes in the soles of my shoes and wore out the elbows of my jacket. But I was so, again, tenacious that I was going to get a job in the Congress. I'd gone out for a summer internship in Washington, and I fell in love with the place, and I just was determined to come back and get a job. So without going into how I got that job and how I moved up in the system, but when I got a break, instead of taking 5 years to move to being on a committee, it took me 5 months, and I was working on one of those committees that actually determine what legislation gets up and organises all the hearings. And then it took me in less than a year, I'd moved to senior professional staff. And then Mitch McConnell needed someone to work on a missing children legislation. He was only a new congressman. He'd been sitting in the Senate for a year and had not spoken a word. He was so intimidated by the people around him, and so he needed a hotshot. And his hatchet woman chief of staff had turned down 27 interviews before I walked in and got an interview with him. And McConnell didn't know how to ask me questions. I had to lead him along. And he had this legislation he wanted to pass. And I said, well, Senator, it's not going to pass. And he looked at me like, how dare you tell me my legislation is not going to pass? I mean, that was the look. And I said, it's not going to pass for these reasons. And I listed 5 things out. And I said, so what you need to do is this, 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 and this to get your legislation up. He didn't speak to me. He just looked at me. He got up, walked to the door, leaned around the post, looked at his chief of staff, and he said, hire him. And that was it. I had the job. And so I wrote Mitch McConnell's first legislation. But the question you asked me about what was the difference between McConnell and working for Kennedy, and Kennedy was head of the committee at that stage, and a very powerful and self-confident individual, as you can imagine. But because I was Australian, I didn't grow up with the Democrats and the Republicans. I was a professional politician. I wrote legislation, I did reports, and I did exceptionally good work that led me to the attention of the White House, where eventually they offered me a job to come and work in the White House. Now, no Australians ever had such an honour or mixed with such royalty of Washington like I did. So I was able to work on issues depending on who asked me. I didn't come at it with an opinion. I was there to do good work on whatever they were asking me to do. So it didn't matter for me, although, as you can see now, I mean, the Congress is divided. Oh, you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. Well, they just knew I was Australian, and I'd shrug my shoulders and I was doing the work.
Now, I suppose that makes a difference, because you're just impartial sort of thing. You're not biased. So they're going to get it. They're more likely to get a direct answer.
Yeah, they
even
did.
If they don't like it.
Yeah, they did. And, so, I mean, I wrote a report. I forget what the subject was now, but I wrote a report on something to do with youth or medicine or drug and alcohol abuse. And I sent it across to a friend in the White House. I said, would you have a look at this? Anyway, time went by and I didn't hear from him. And then I got a call from the office of the chief medical person in America. He was the top doctor. And the phone call just said that he wants to see you. And I thought, oh, no, what have I done? I'm only 33, 34. And I had to get on a train and go to Maryland and find the hospital. It's a very famous hospital. And, I got out of the train and walked across, and I didn't know what was going on. And there I was sitting in front of this top doctor. And he asked me about the paper I'd written. And he said, "You're going to have hearings on it." I said, "Yes." And he asked me a few more questions. And then he said, "I want you to invite me to speak at your hearing." Well, you try getting these guys to show up for hearing unless you subpoena them. And he was this guy. So I, basically danced back to the committee and the head of it and said, we've got to hold a hearing because the chief medical officer wants to come. So we set it all up, and the TV cameras were there and the celebrities, and, and I prepared all the books, and the congressmen were all there reading what they were supposed to do. And on came the chief medical officer, and he started to read his paper. And as I listened, I thought, oh, that's rather intelligent. And then I thought, geez, there's a few familiar phrases in that. And he was reading my paper, and it became US health policy.
Well, there you go.
Oh yeah, and I've had something else.
Did he give credit where it was due, or just?
Oh no, but anyway, whatever. But I also did something that went across. I wrote the legislation, and of course the White House picks up everything and went through it. And I got a phone call from the White House, and the woman said, "You've done HR 1175 to do with taxation and families." I said, "Yes." She said, "Don't worry about it. We think it's brilliant. We're just going to do it." So it didn't go through the Congress. They just did it. And, and she said, the president's going to announce it in his Labor Day speech. And that was it. They wrote me a nice little letter, handwritten letter. Of course, I framed it. Getting a handwritten letter from the White House is better than, one that's typed out. So I put it in a frame and put it on the wall. So that was that was the dynamic. So, where that goes is, if you don't understand that sort of level and the involvement and the intensity, I'd stand there with 5 telephones all going at once, and I'd press different buttons and be doing deals. And I'd stand and do politics all day, working it all out before it got anywhere near a congressman. I remember with that legislation I wrote with Mitch McConnell, we were ready to put it on the floor of the Senate. And again, I got a phone call, and it was the head of the FBI. I think his name was Webster at the time. And he said, "Chris, you're going to do this, but there's something in it we don't like." This is the FBI telling me they don't like something. And they said, "We want you to change these words." And I said, this has taken me months to sort of beat off all the lobbyists to get to this point. There's no way I'm going to be able to walk into my senator and just say, "Oh, the FBI wants this." I said, "Could you please formalize it and write me a letter so when I go in with the changes and I get screamed at, I can hand him the letter and say, the FBI's requested it," which I did. And that quieted down McConnell because he was having a fit. So because I got a letter from Webster to say, this is the changes we want, it went through. But for me to be sort of there and getting calls from people like Webster. I got a chance to go and sit in the Senate dining room. Now, nobody that you would know, and certainly no Prime Minister, and I doubt any English Prime Minister has ever been invited to the Senate dining room, because all of these people are millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires. Rockefeller was sitting there, Kennedy, you got Ritchie with all that money, Senator Hines of all the Heinz products, and Chris. So there we all were having lunch in this select dining room. What opportunities to be sitting there and just sort of rubbing shoulders with the men who were running the world in terms of the decisions that they made.
Okay, and then what brought you back to Australia then? Why didn't you end up?
Well, it's a funny sort of a thing. You hear about sportsmen. If you're going to be good at anything, you leave the country. And actors, of course, used to go off to England. And if you're in sports or acting these days, you go off to America. Well, it happened to me by accident. I was interested in politics and issues. And I ended up in America, not because I went on purpose, but I worked for the biggest game in the world, as you've just seen on television. I just read this morning that when Harris decided that she was running, she got $1 billion in donations. I mean, mega money for a person to become the president of the United States. And I was in there. I was working with them. I could call anyone in the White House and I could get interviews. I even demanded that people who work for the White House show up because I was subpoenaing them to come over, and they would testify because I wrote the letter. When I came back to Australia, and the question was, why did I? I suppose I was patriotic. I was at a brink that I'd worked for the system for 5 years and I remained Australian. But I'd hit my limit where I basically had to become an American citizen if I wanted to really keep up the job. But I thought I could bring back whatever I'd done, what talent I had, and come back and work in the Australian system. But I was naive because, I mean, that is the ocean of politics, and I really did step back into the pond. And it took me 2 years to calm down before I could have a civil conversation where people could talk to me, because the amount that the billions of dollars that went through my head when I thought economics or the major programs or the decisions that we were making were far above and beyond anything that goes on here. And often politics comes over as just squabbling rather than foresight or entrepreneurial approaches to major problems. So anyway, I mean, I came back and in some ways, maybe it was a mistake. I should have stayed in America. But anyway, I'm glad. I love the country. I severely love the country. And it's not the political game, but in politics, there's sort of only so much you can take, of course, because it's just every week it's another fight, it's another battle, it's another report. So most people only last 3 years in working in Washington, and I was there for 5-6 years before I came home.
And then you came down to the little pond and swum with minnows. So how did that go, and where did that take you to?
Well, when I got off the plane, I slept for the first day and I had my family with me. And then I called a fellow by the name of John O. Johnson. He was the president of the New South Wales Senate. Now, he had met me in Washington. He had been invited to the prayer breakfast that happens every year. And this is several thousand people come in for a couple of weeks, and they have stacks of meetings, and eventually we all have breakfast with the president. So I'd worked with these people, a Christian organisation that had been going since the Second World War. And so I had breakfast with the president for 3 years in a row. And so he saw me in this context that I wasn't just an Australian. I was helping to organise all of this and being treated as I was a celebrity, as senior professional staff. So he befriended me. And when I came back, I gave him a call, told him I was back in Australia. He picked up the phone and he said, I want you to go down to Canberra tomorrow. So he called Graham Richardson and he said, in Labor Party talk, he said, I'm sending Christopher Reynolds down to see you tomorrow. He's good value. Whenever he shows up, drop what you're doing and talk to him. Then he called Beasley and he said the same thing. I'm sending Chris down to talk to you tomorrow. Just meet him. And I think Lionel Bowen as well. So I was on the plane the next morning and in Canberra, and Beasley offered me the job of ambassador, the Australian ambassador back to Washington, because nobody in the country had my experience with Washington. But I said, oh, well, I've just got back from Washington. I don't really want to go. And I mean, I've been kicking myself ever since, Basically being offered the job of, Consul General or the ambassador. And I said, no, I don't think so.
Well, we're all entitled to a mistake. But anyway, yeah.
Well, I went on to be head of the World Trade Center and put that into Sydney, and all that Darling Harbour was all my work. I was the executive officer in charge of Darling Harbour, all the ports, and I also did the Grim Reaper campaign. You may remember that years ago.
Yeah, for AIDS.
Yeah, well, I knew more about the subject than anybody else in the country, and I wrote the report. And Ida Buttrose was the chairman of the committee, and she looked at me and listened to what I had to say, and she said, you've got the job. But the next day, the leading public relations company in Australia were really upset that I'd won the competition and they didn't. So they said, how about we pay you 3 times as much money than what you're going to get and come and work for us? And I said, well, I didn't want to be Mr. AIDS anyway. And I walked away from all of that. the fellow holding up the flipboards for me in the back of the room, a young fellow that worked for Grey Advertising, who came up with a stupid idea of the Grim Reaper. And now the Grim Reaper was all my work, because people would not believe how serious this disease was going to be in Australia. So I developed the Grim Reaper concept, but this young fella decided that the Grim Reaper was going to do bowling and bowl down people at the bottom of the thing, only because I don't know what he was smoking at the time, but he also did bowling the night before and decided that he was going to do up all the drawings of the Grim Reaper doing bowling balls. So when I walked away from that, then the media suddenly said, well, this guy Reynolds, Christopher Reynolds, has won this thing. Where is he? But it turned out the kid at the back of the room's name was Simon Reynolds. And so they pinned it all on Simon and gave him the credit. But Simon went on to do absolutely nothing. He never came up with one original thought from that time forward. And I went on to get 5 contracts with BHP and work on some marvellously huge contracts. So anyway, that was me coming back to Australia.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just put over screen share now, and we'll talk about what a capital idea, Australia, 1770 to 1901. So this book, when did you sort of get the idea or the inkling to start writing it and putting it together?
Well, I got a phone call, and this publisher said, I've just had a phone call from one of the biggest publishers in the world, Scholastic, and they're looking to do a children's book on Australian history for primary school. And I said, Australian history for primary school? I said, how on earth can you do that? I mean, how do we simplify it or dumb down the information? I don't mean to criticize the kids, but how do we simplify it so that you're going to be able to teach it at primary school level? I said, that's a bit of a task. I said, I may have focused on this topic when I did my PhD in rewriting the Australian Constitution. But I said, it's been a while since I did the research. I said, let me get back into it. And when I got the research there, I said, then we can talk about how we then shape it. Well, once I got into the topic, I spread 12 books on Australian history on the floor to have a look and see what people were writing about. But it didn't take me long before I realised how boring they all were. They were just shocking. It was all this yellowing paper, and all the print was so small and squashed together, no headings, and you didn't know what you're looking at. If I found a fact, I'd be turning back 5 pages to try and find a date that suited the fact that I was reading. If there were any pictures, they were usually squashed together in the middle of the book in black and white, and they looked good, but you couldn't work out what the picture had to say about what you'd previously reading. So I decided that the research was also pretty terrible in as much as they were repeating the same stuff. So that one guy was up to the 5th edition of the same stuff. Or he put out a new book, a new title, but it was the same old gear. And I decided that they were all caught in what I called the Santa Claus syndrome. And that is, they kept telling themselves the same story often enough that they started to believe it. But when I got into the research, what we think is Australian history just was not the truth. And so I decided that I'd set 3 tenets to doing the research and rewriting the various topics that make up, the history of Australia. So the first tenet was that of integrity. I am a qualified academic, and I would have no opinion. I would come at this topic as I would anything as I worked in Washington, and that is, I would look for the facts. Now, I may not like them, but I would only discover the facts. I would take it on the chin, but I would write what I found. So integrity was the first thing. The second thing was to chase the money trail. Nothing happens in politics that doesn't involve money. And the third tenet comes from my theological training, and it's called Sitz in Leben. And it's a German phrase that means situation in life. So what was the context in which people made decisions? What were the influences? What else was going on around the people that sat in the lounge room, Prime Minister Pitt's lounge room, and discussed the New South Wales venture and got all so excited about it? What were the influences? So I came at the topic of looking at original documents, as many as I could get. So in that book, What a Capital Idea, there's 300 references, of which I read more than 600 books and articles. I quote some 300, but half of those are at least 100 years old. And so I was looking for original documents. And when I found the original legislation for felons, the people who committed crimes that were transported out of England, that document, that earliest document, was 1595. Say that again. 1595 was the first laws passed to do with what to do with people who committed misdemeanor crimes, and it was called the Poor Laws. And I'm looking at the handwritten document. I mean, you know, the research I did. I sent a copy of the book off to Jeffrey Blaney. You know, I respect Jeffrey's work, even though he was still caught up in the Santa Claus syndrome. So I sent it to Jeffrey. I enjoyed his work over the years. And Jeffrey wrote back and he said, my goodness, he said, the research. He said, you even know how many Bibles that Johnson took out with him on the first fleet. And I thought, you're just getting started. You wait till you get into it. And the money and the economics and the people and the legislation. And so I was just dedicated to finding what really went on. And of course, then I said, well, these are the main chapters. There's 27 topics here. And I'm going to limit myself to something like 20 pages per chapter. So that meant not only did I have to be accurate in what I was saying, I also needed to be comprehensive. I needed to comprehend what I was reading without all the extra bits. I had to tell people succinctly what was happening for each of these major events. And so I had learnt my writing skills in America. And so I write rather well, and as you pick it up and read it, you can see that I use a lot of single clause sentences, and I play around with conjunctions, and I work out what my paragraphs are. So people constantly say to me, "Oh, it's so easy to read," and I thought, you know, there's all these pictures out there, and that I need to bring them up into publication quality, 300 DPI, and I did. I found a program, and so I put 300 pictures in that book, so you can see what you're reading about, what I'm talking about. And so it's become a good book. I've, in terms of popularity, I've sold 1,500 books in less than a year, and another 1,000 books arrived last week. And I'm just going to keep selling them, you know, and I'm selling 40 to 50 books a week. And that's how not just popular, it's how interested people are in our history and wanting to find pride in this marvelous country that's being eroded in the current climate that we're in. And so people are just taking hold of the book, and of course it presents well. You see the cover and people it's got the wow factor. The moment you open it, you say, wow, just have a look at this. But isn't that the way we should be presenting our history, so that it's readable, presentable, colourful? And so that's what I've done.
I think one of the biggest problems with Australians in Australia is we don't really know our history very well. And I mean, even if you go back to our era of education, when we did have the old social studies, and we did have the story about Australia, and that, a lot of it is more anecdotal than it is actually factual. And it's a lot of it aligned with what your parents told you as well. But I know some of the things after a bit of more exploring, what my parents were telling us about Australia wasn't factually correct. You know, I lived in West Australia, and my parents, you know, had an understanding through their school system, my school system, in regards to Australian history. But gee whiz, we're really off the mark in context of things like what happened in Tasmania. I mean, everyone was convinced, you know, that we were doing atrocities over there and things like that. Oh. And that was the general pattern and accepted sort of conversation. And it still gets in the history books these days, and maybe a little bit to your namesake. There's another guy called Reynolds, who's a a Tasmanian. And I think Windshuttle's had a few problems with his history in regards to his referencing. But just picking up one thing about going back and checking the facts, one thing the British were excellent on is that's on archiving. They must have, the greatest archive system going, because I think just if you think of all the colonies and all the activities they're in, they all had to go send correspondence back to the colonial office or whatever, and all those documents are still there. And so while people might beat the drum that this or that happened, but the actual documents by people who were there at the time, and unless you got some sort of bent idea that these people were fabricating stuff at that time because they wanted to make it look better, further on in history, you've got to be a bit strange in the head. I mean, these people wrote as they saw it. I mean, it wasn't just like when Arthur went down to Tasmania. There was a surgeon and also I think there was a priest. They were chartered to actually put in their documents as well. It wasn't just by one person telling what was going on in Tasmania. There were several people independently filing reports back to the colonial office. So you're going to find the real truth in those archives.
Yeah, when I was beginning this and I was getting into all these documents, I asked myself the same question: how is it that I am doing all this research and finding all this stuff that hasn't been written before? And I was getting really frustrated with the fact that the job had fallen to me. And I had to admit that the internet has made such a difference. When I was doing my PhD at this great university, I could walk into the library and I could say, I want these 6 books from England. And they would write to England and say, Chris wants these books. And wherever it was in England, they would send them. And it would take, they'd come by sea. And so I'd wait a couple of months and the books had arrived. Now, 2 of them were worth reading and the other 4 would be on the floor. And, I'd go back and get some more. It was so hard to get original documents. And so with the internet, I've been able to, as you just pointed out, my wife would just listen to me all the time. I would be finding new things and I'd rush into the room and I'd say, I've got into the archives of the British Foreign Office, the archives. Yes, dear. But, as you just pointed out, and I could get anything. And so I've got the letters that were written by John MacArthur to the Privy Council in July 1804. And I'm reading what he actually said before the council. And then I've got the council's response, because the City of London, and people don't appreciate even today how powerful the City of London was, had said to the Privy Council and to the Secretary of State for Colony and Wars, we want you to do this. Now, there was never, and still isn't, any argument with the City of London, so they had to do something. But I've got the correspondence. And here's an example of the problem. I got into this legislation I mentioned in 1595 with the Poor Laws, and it had to do with felons. And then they amended the legislation again in 1717 under one of the King Georges, and again in 1784 under Lord Sydney, the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies. So he very much knew the legislation. Well, I got into that legislation, and there were 3 very interesting things about how they were dealing to give people a second chance at life by getting them out of the slums of England and overseas. Give them 7 and 14 years and give them labour. And someone put me onto the fact that the legislation is based upon a verse out of the Bible, Ephesians 4:28. And the verse says, if he is a thief, let him be given labour that he might be transformed from his ways and help others. And that was exactly what the legislation was doing. It was out to give people a second chance at life. But the thing is, I read through this legislation that got me was I found a clause that said, if a person is between the ages of 15 and 21, they can volunteer to be transported. And although, wait a minute, I've got the totally wrong idea about people who are being sent to Australia. Once I got hold of that, I started to understand why there was not a jail set up in Sydney for the next 8 years. Why, after 4 years, when Arthur Phillip was leaving, 85% of the people in the first, the second, and the third fleets, 85% he had set free. There was no 7 or 14 years. He just decided that this person needed a new start at life, and he did. What was interesting is we often think that it was a penal settlement, and yet the statistics show, I think the words recidivism, the repeat offenders, was only 2% in that first 20 years of the settlement. Today, it's 65%. You tell me which is the penal colony. It wasn't in 1788. And all of those transportees were told to go and build their own homes. And so Philip talks about this, about how they're building their own homes, and, you know, they weren't into very good building construction sorts of skills. And along came the first storm and blew them all over again, and they had to learn how to build homes that, you know, could actually stand up a storm. And that's all in his diary. Why hasn't anybody read this? So I thought I'd get into Manning Clark. You know, as you can probably see behind me, I've got the full 6 volumes there of Manning Clark. I got that for my 40th birthday just a couple of Christmases back ago. And anyway, I got into Manning Clark, and I'll find him talking about this very significant legislation to do with the colony of New South Wales and transported convicts. And I found it. And this incredible legislation that I read and I explain in chapter 6 of the book, he gives 2 sentences in reference to this incredibly important legislation. And Manning Clark says, I haven't read it, but I know of a woman who has read it. And that is all he said about the legislation that was fundamental to understanding the people that were sent to Australia. And you can see why I was getting angry with the fact that it wasn't just that people didn't know our history, people who were given the job of explaining our history were doing an absolutely bad job in our universities.
Well, I'll just put up a screen share, because this is really what the perception of most people when they think of, you know, our history as well, we just a land of convicts, you know. So this is the holding hulks on the Thames River, and there was quite a lot of them. And that's the sort of things that we've got from, you know, anecdotal history and very poor history, is that all these criminals, and well, admittedly, I mean, they talk about some of the offences that they were fairly minor and they were transported for 14 years, but still the perception is that these people were the dregs of society. They're criminals. They're held by. The prisons were over full, and they put on these wrecked boats on the Thames because prisons were so overcrowded. And gee, what a great idea! We'll get rid of them. We'll send them to Australia. So that's the general perception, and it's still common, and nothing can be further from the truth.
Yeah, can I pick that up?
Especially in regards to what you're saying. Let
me pick this up. You've got a great topic there.
No one built a prison here and sent people here to prison.
Yeah, all right. You've got 2 topics. In that period of time in the 18th century, England was experiencing the Wesleyan Methodist revival. Hundreds of thousands of people had renewed Christian faith or became Methodists. Millions in America. It was something that the historians have just stepped over without understanding the context of what this legislation was about or what was being done. But Wesley starts with this movement, and he goes to Newgate Prison, and he sees how bad it is that he starts to bring food and clothing. He then gets on his horse and visits 59 prisons in 90 days, and he starts prison reform. And this led to 3 bits of legislation around the 1770s and 80s. And the first one was to actually fix up the buildings. So there was legislation passed to do something about fixing up the conditions. The second major legislation was based on the fact that they had a whole new concept of reformation. You could actually reform prisoners. Maybe there was hope. Maybe they weren't burned prisoners. So there was a whole new movement, and money had been spent for some 10 years at least on reforming the prisons. While they took in some 5,000 new prisoners into the British and Wales prison system each year, sending 700 of the people who were in prisons to Australia made absolutely no difference to the number of people, crowded or not, that were in England. So it's actually an opinion to say the prisons were overcrowded. It's not necessarily a fact. Now, when we come to the hulks, you see, the people that were sentenced to transportation were not sentenced to incarceration. They were being sentenced to labour, to work, to get them out of the country. But after the wars with America, yes, they couldn't send people who'd been sentenced to transportation. So they passed a law to try and amend this so that people sentenced to transportation could actually work and stay in England. Major piece of legislation, one of the three. Now, that meant that they brought the hulks on for people to actually live on the hulks in the Thames and other places who had been sentenced to transportation. And when I got into the hulks, what happened was that a person who was convicted for stealing something, and that was a misdemeanor crime, or prostitution, they were first put on a clearing hulk to assess them. And so people were cleaned, they were fed, they were clothed, and they were assessed as to what skills they had and what health needs they had. And then they were assigned to a different hulk, and they joined a team of people who were then assigned to do various work details. So they cleaned up the rivers and they cleaned up the streets because why? They had been sentenced to labour.
So they were the first environmentalists looking after cleaning up the environment.
Yeah, they were. And so when Philip got the new gig of going off to Australia, he could only pick people to go to Australia who had been sentenced to transportation. And so he went around a number of prisons and trying to find people that also had skill. I think he ended up with about 40% of the 700 that had some sort of skill and ability to do something. So they were mainly young people that he looked for that could actually make a contribution to building a community. I remember the day in what should be Australia Day, which was February the 7th. And the band got in, the soldiers got dressed in their uniforms, and the Marines were all there, and the bands played, and the convicts sat on the grass, and the Aborigines led on trees and watched this great procession. And David Collins, the new Attorney General, read out the letters patent from the King that established the legal, political, and social systems of a country, but we don't teach it in school. Why? Then, after Philip got up and he said to the convicts, he said, "You have received all the good grace that England can afford you, and now you are in Australia. And I want you to know that if you put your shoulder to the wheel and you make a go of turning this scrub into a town worth living in, you will get my blessing. If you go and cross me and you go and break any of the laws, believe me, you have received all the graces that England has ever afforded you, and you'll get no more." So he laid it out pretty straight there that if you wanted to make a go of your life, this was your opportunity. And we don't appreciate what a phenomenal experiment it was for them to start a community on the other side of the earth with people that had not been sentenced to incarceration. They were not what we'd call today convicts, although they do use that word. But we've got to understand who these people were.
We're sort of getting towards an hour of that, but the idea in regards to Australia happening in the context that it did, why I mean, it was 200 years, almost 200 years before when the Dutch started running into the west coast and things like that of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And we had France in India. We had the Portuguese running around also besides the Dutch in the Indian Ocean and and the Spanish in the Philippines and that. Why did it get left so long? And what was the trigger, right? What was the trigger to say, right, at this point in time, at this point in history, we need to move some part of England 12,000 miles away?
Okay, it's a good question. And the biggest company in the world, and probably even if you stacked it up today, it would still come out to be a huge company, was the British East India Company. And they had something like 400 of their own ships. They had their own army. And so it was the French, always the French, that were causing problems. Now, after the last war they had with England, both England and France were in severe debts, some $250 billion each. Anyway, they were trying to work it out, but France got some money from Holland and was building up their navy. And it was the British East India Company that said to Prime Minister Pitt, you must do something about the French and the French Navy because we think they're coming down here. Now, you asked the question about for 200 years, people have been coming down the coastline and even Cook coming down the west coast line and coming down the east coast line. Why didn't people come here before? And the answer is it wasn't commercially viable. You see, all those settlements, whether they were Spanish or whether they were English, the colonies were set up by private companies. And out of England, you had to get a letters patent or a commission that allowed you to go off and set up the Virginia Company if you wanted to go to America. But the terms were that we'll give you permission to go off and you'll get our protection if you go to Virginia, but you must trade back to England. And so England then got the taxes on the imported goods. But nobody was interested in coming to this continent because nobody could see that it was commercially viable. Where was the money in coming to Australia? There wasn't any. So nobody was coming here. All they could see was natives who ran around and threw spears at them, or the cannibals who were eating, in some instances, eating their own children. It was a terrible situation for the explorer who landed on the various coastlines. So various people, including Dampier, had reported that the natives in this country were the most primitive in the world. And so there was no commercial interest. In fact, there was a joke being passed around the parliament at the time. It's a bit out of context, but one politician said to the other, did you hear the one about sending convicts to Australia? No, said the other. He said, they want us to pay for it. And this was a joke that there was no way the government was going to pay to set up a colony. But they did. And they did it because the British East India Company said, you will need a military base within striking distance of India. And I often thought, well, why didn't they go to Darwin? Well, it was too hot and uncomfortable. Why didn't they go to the west coast of Australia? Well, it was all desert. And when you come down the east coast, the first bay that they saw that was reasonable, Cook had said, was Botany Bay. So it seemed like, when I look at a map, a long way from India, but they didn't seem to think that, a week's travel on a ship was very much. Anyway, it was virtually virtue signalling, is that we'd call it today, to the French, that we're in the region and we're going to be watching for you. But it wasn't a commercially viable situation. And that's why nobody came here. So what was the turning point that made Australia commercially viable? It was sheep eating the dry grass across the plains. And that began the economic phenomenal story of sheep, wheat, and minerals. The gold that came out of Australia was extraordinary. 40% of the world's gold came out of Australia. So this was the turning point. And it was the first time that the British government had actually put some money to forming a government-run settlement. So yes, it was in the Industrial Revolution, and yes, money was the major cause for the settlements, or the spread of colonies in the name of industrialising, and it still goes on, of course. But Australia was a different case because it was set up basically as a military base. to protect the British East India Company.
The interesting thing is, yes, we've gone to this situation where we did become a really rich country, and at times there we've had the richest city in the world, like Melbourne. I think when we had the gold rush in Victoria, Melbourne was the richest city on earth, and we've had various instances, where we've sort of clothed the world with wool and things like that, and even into the 20th century, our wheat and things like that. But it must have still been a terribly big gamble. I mean, yes, as a military positioning sort of thing, but gee whiz, it's still a big venture and costly. I mean, I've read a little bit about Governor Phillip, and he's an interesting person in himself in regards, before he even got this gig, he was his naval history, and he's working with the Portuguese, which is a fairly interesting story in itself. Why is the British officer working so in depth with the Portuguese and things like that? But then you start to get the understanding later on in that. Well, it's not exactly a spy, but it's sort of a relationship with a third lower power at that time, but still an influential power. And also the knowledge you glean from the Portuguese seamanship, the charts, and all, because they were out there in the Atlantic, in 15, just in the early 1500s. So, they got a lot of information from their navals set up as well. So he's an interesting person himself. But why do you think he got the gig?
Why did he get the gig? Well, in actual fact, as I looked at Phillip, he was a bit of a person who sort of wasn't a success at anything. He was in the Navy, and then there was the war stopped, and he asked permission, as you just pointed out, if he could go off and work for the Portuguese as a sailor in the Portuguese army. So he learned to speak Portuguese. His father was German, so he spoke German and French and English. So he spoke a number of languages, and he was only a short sort of a fellow with darker skin, and so he passed off as a very well as a spy. But it was after he married a woman while there wasn't a war on, and she had a farm. And so he basically took over running the farm, and she was a bit of an aristocrat and was never home. And he became friends with the foreman by the name of Henry Dodd. So he went off, and he went back to Lord Sydney, who'd become a friend, because he was very good at strategy, a naval strategy, of thinking things through and how to fight the Spanish. And so Sydney gave him a referral to Nepean, Evan Nepean, and Nepean was in charge of the Secret Service, the British Secret Service, which became MI5 and MI6. And so he was working there like the same organisation that James Bond worked for. And I wondered if his number was 001. He was Arthur Phillip as a spy getting around France and writing reports. So he was sort of knocking about a bit. And I thought about, why did he get the job? Well, he seemed to have some skill, and Lord Sydney and Evan thought he had a bit of a skill. But the other sort of a thing was that if the colony failed or got taken over or something, Phillip wasn't an aristocrat, so there wouldn't be any public humiliation for one of the top families. And so he got the gig basically because he could do it, and because he wasn't anyone that was well known in case there was a failure. But Phillip went to see Henry Dodd, who'd been the formula, and said, I've got this new thing going on. Yes, I know about the flies and the natives and the crocodiles and the snakes, but we'll make a go of it, and I'll pay you some terrific money. So Henry Dodd came out with Phillip, and it was actually Henry Dodd who had also worked for the Portuguese Navy for many years. It was Henry that was able to give the convicts a clip under the ear when they wouldn't get out of bed, and line them all up and threaten them with this, etc. Because the governor couldn't come down and go kicking them around and making them work, but Dodd did. And Dodd started the gardens, and his first garden was a success outside Government House. He then went across to, I think, Fern Bay, which is next to the Opera House on the other side there, and then he started Garden Island. And it was Henry Dodd that got the young fella Roos growing vegetables out near Parramatta, because Roos didn't know what he was doing. And it was Henry that showed him how to grow vegetables. And I think it was the second Christmas, Henry presented the governor with a cabbage that weighed 12 kilos. Now, I'm allowed 7 kilos getting on the plane, you know, when I fly around. And you think 12-kilo cabbage.
It must have got a lot of love and attention.
Oh, yeah, love and attention. But even Colin says, you know, the vegetables are growing fine and we've got another crop this year. So I thought, well, where is this famine business? Where do we have this starvation? And I really searched for it. And of course, in Sydney and many other parts on the coast, we get a dry spell in the middle of winter. We get 3 or 4 months where there isn't any rain, you know, over winter. And it was in that period that you know, obviously you couldn't grow crops. The Aboriginal people were starving. And Philip was having, every time they went out and caught fish, and we're talking thousands of fish, they were sharing them with the Aborigines. And at one stage, the Aborigines were so hungry that, you know, the men lined up at the beach and basically said, you know, we're hungry. And the captain gave them the whole catch, which was good thinking. But there was other supplies, you know, it was rice and wheat and clothing and all sorts of other foods. It wasn't just the vegetables that we were running short of, and took a while to get those supplies built up. But here's another little thing while we're on that. In that first year, we don't realise how well Arthur Phillip got on with the Aborigines. And within 2 years of him arriving with just 700 Marines and 700 leftover transportee convicts, Arthur Phillip was made an Aboriginal elder. And Bennelong actually had a ceremony and made him a member of the tribe. And from that time on, Bennelong called him father, not governor. And he was given the name Wallawari. And so there he was, an Aboriginal elder. And we certainly totally miss how integrated that first settlement was in terms of the Aborigines mixing in and flowing through and back and forth within the colony. So it was a terrific experiment that came off.
Well, look, we've gone over the hour, and we've just touched on the subject we wanted, that we weren't a prison, right?
We weren't a prison,
and we aren't all bloody descendants of bloody convicts.
No.
And I think that's a very important message people need to understand. And
yeah, they do.
We really need to go back to the history. But if we come back to this topic maybe in a couple of weeks and talk about just the first fleet and those first few years, because I find it strange. Like you're coming from the northern hemisphere, then you're going down to the southern area, you're arriving in the worst possible time I can think of, in a stinking January in Sydney, when you got to get the heaters, and so you just come from England, sitting in somewhere cold. You started off in their best of their summer sort of thing, and then you come over to the worst of our summer, and then the trouble with China, well, here we are, but then what do we go to grow? You know, did we arrive too early, too late for the season, what we want to plant? And then we've got to do all this work. So maybe we can come back and have a look at that logistics and that first fleet in the next conversation. But what I'd really like to do, if you could come back fairly soon in the next week or so and talk us through what we've just gone through yesterday, and whether we like it or not. I reckon a good few Australians were glued to their TV yesterday sometime looking at the US election. Yes, years ago it was a non-event to us, but now it's so critical, and it's so critical for us to understand the implications of it. Maybe you can give us an insight of what happened yesterday and what's going to happen in the next few weeks, sort of thing, in regards to how do you get from president-elect to inauguration in particular, and how being in Washington, you must have some insight in regards to how do you pick a team to deliver what's so important to the whole, not only to your own country, but to the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, you've got some good topics there. We can do a whole hour. Here's another good one that the whole business, people think there was a race with La Perouse to get to Australia. And this is, again, the greatest piece of nonsense, absolute nonsense. And he wasn't in a race. He actually dropped into Botany Bay in the hope that he could get his boat fixed because he'd struck a leak. And he was most disappointed that Sydney was not already a settlement that could do some repairs on his ships. So, I mean, you know.
And unfortunately for him, whatever repairs were done didn't get him back home, or didn't get him much further
home.
than the
No, he couldn't
Pacific.
get his ships fixed. He sailed into the Pacific and got in a storm and, of course, was killed. But the interaction that took place at that time is also fascinating, just to sort of get an idea of where the world was really at. You know, because, I mean, Britain was the greatest empire that the world has ever seen. I mean, there was one stage when, you know, you and I were in school, that you could look at a globe and all the parts of the Commonwealth or the empire were pink. And you could see, as they said, the sun never sets on the empire. And it didn't. And that's how huge Britain was. So here they were just showing up on the shores of Australia. And it was sort of like camping out. You know, showing up at the Narrabeen Caravan Park and saying we're pitching our tent over there. And I mean, the contrast of the incredible wealth and development in industry that was in England, and just sort of showing up with, as again, and this is not a criticism as such, but people who had not developed, they were underdeveloped, we'd say politely, but as others have said, the most primitive people on earth. What surprises me is how well a number of Aboriginal people got on from that point once they also got the opportunities.
Yeah,
anyway, another good topic to explore.
We could talk on. I think. I mean, I know a little bit of the history in regards to the integration of Indigenous people in the Sydney area, and it was quite interesting that it didn't take them long, really, for a number to adapt and even work and enjoy being part of society. It basically went wrong after we went to Tasmania, and then we started to get this system out of Tasmania in regards to, we're losing these people. We've got to protect them and separate them from the scourge of our people in basically our morals.
Well, again, I think
evil things and our disease.
I think that needs to be explored as well. Anyway, you referred to the book behind me, and if people are interested, if they're really interested in the truth of Australian history, this wonderful story, you can get it by just looking up the title of the book, What a Capital Idea, or looking up my name, Christopher Reynolds, or going to the website, reynoldslearning.com, and go to history, and you'll be able to buy it online. But I know it's a big book, and I've tried to get the price down. But once you get into it, you will find it's the best piece of Australian history that you've ever managed to pick up and read.
It's sort of big. Because I've got a virtual background, it doesn't come up too well. And if we got the thickness there,
Well, talking about Tasmanians, I got talked into making it a hard-covered book by Eric Abetz from Tasmania. He was the former Deputy Prime Minister. And so when he read the work I was doing, he gave me a phone call and he talked me into doing the hard-covered version. He said, this book's too important just to be another soft cover. Put the money in it and make it a decent book worth reading. So that's why you've got this wonderful big book.
Well, I also believe it should be in all our libraries as well.
Yeah.
Our libraries have a very poor, and I've asked the Cairns Library to put it, buy it and that. They come back with some sort of reason that it's not on the suppliers list, and I said, well, that's not good enough. So anyway, I paid $4.50 for them to source it and that. So. We'll see what happens from that, but it's something that should be on all the library bookshelves.
If you've got a library, I'll donate a copy to their library.
No, it's time people paid up. I mean, they wasted enough taxpayers' money on. They might as well pay for some good value.
They might as well pay for it. Yeah, and they will, because I mean, once somebody borrows it from the library, it'll go missing.
But I mean, there's another few episodes in this. But when we put up we will post this episode to Line and YouTube, and we'll put the link to yourself and to the book so people can click on it.
Yeah.
But
Well,
if you can
we've got some great
work out
topics.
when you're available to come and talk us
Yeah.
about the US
And
election,
yeah.
maybe next week, be great.
Yeah, I mean, you've got some great topics. Why didn't the British do a treaty? Was there really an invasion? What happened with the Eureka Stockade? And the really big one: should Australia or could Australia become a republic? There's a good one, and we could have a look at the whole process of how they decided to form a federated country and what happened with the Constitution. Another really great topic that's never discussed, but it's a great story. Anyway,
Well,
yes, let's do another session.
There's another story there for New Zealand. Why did we suddenly buy into New Zealand in 1840 when they were already, there was already settlers there, and then suddenly the British had to go and make a treaty to sort of protect them? Well, if you run off over there, you're asking for trouble in those days.
Well, it already came under the governor of New South Wales, but the big problem was the cannibalism. And it was one tribe that was crying because the tribe next door was coming and eating their babies. And so something had to be done, and the British government got involved, and that's how they eventually wrote a treaty to try and get them to stop eating each other. And
maybe someone in New Zealand needs to write a book on New Zealand.
Yeah, they should, yeah. But that's another good story.
Someone else's job. Look, Chris, it's been great having you on tonight. If you just stay on air, we'll have a chat off air.
Good, thank you. Pleasure.
All right, thanks very much. If you like tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next Wednesday, I'll be talking to Michael Darby. Now, Michael is the presenter for Subtracks, and he's out of West Australia, and he talks about a lot of controversial issues. And so we'll have a discussion with Michael Darby next week. Thank you very much.